Cops throw black boy into lake without knowing who his father was. Hey there, mates. Before we dive into this gripping tale, don't forget to smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell to stay tuned for more jaw-dropping stories. Chuck a comment below telling us which city you're watching from. This story's gonna knock your socks off from start to finish. It was a seemingly peaceful afternoon in a small town just outside of Boston, Massachusetts. Michael, a 12-year-old African-American boy, was walking home from school along the edge of the town's lake, a route he took every day. His pristine school uniform and backpack didn't prevent 3 police officers from eyeing him suspiciously from across the street. "Oi, Sarge," whispered Officer Johnson, his Aussie accent still strong despite years in the States. "That kid looks sus to you?" What these officers didn't know was that at that very moment, FBI Special Agent Marcus Smith, Michael's father, and one of the most decorated agents in Bureau history, was wrapping up an operation that would dismantle one of the country's largest criminal organizations. Coincidentally, this operation was investigating cases of police corruption. The heavy summer air carried an invisible tension. Michael felt the stares, but continued on his way, remembering what his father always taught him. "Keep your head high, son. You owe no one an explanation for your existence." Little did he know those words would carry far more weight in the next few minutes. "Blimey, he's got some nerve, that one," muttered Sergeant Williams, his British accent contrasting sharply with his American uniform. "Let's have a chit-chat with the lad, shall we?" The 3 officers began to approach, their shadows stretching on the ground like dark omens. The sound of their boots on the pavement echoed louder and louder, while Michael's phone vibrated in his pocket, an unread message from his father that would change everything. "Holy smokes, boys," chimed in Officer Thompson, his Canadian politeness barely masking his prejudice. "That backpack looks mighty heavy for just school stuff, eh?" As the lake's usually tranquil waters lapped gently at the shore, the scene was set for a confrontation that would shake the nation. The sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of blood red, while the lake's surface reflected the last light of day. The wind carried the scent of hot dogs from a nearby stand, mixed with the distinct odor of the lake's still waters, creating an atmosphere that oscillated between the familiar and the menacing. Michael's heart raced, but he maintained his composure. He could hear his father's voice in his head. "Remember, son, in the face of injustice, your dignity is your greatest weapon." Little did anyone know, this encounter by the lake would spark a chain of events that would expose decades of corruption, challenge deep-seated prejudices, and potentially change the course of the nation's history. Special Agent Marcus Smith wasn't just another FBI agent. At 45, African-American, with honors from Harvard Law, he'd built his career combating the very corruption he now investigated. His wife, Helen, had died during Michael's birth, and since then, father and son had developed a unique and powerful bond. Marcus raised the boy alone, balancing life as a federal agent with fatherhood, always teaching his son about integrity and justice. "Crikey, it ain't easy being a single dad and a Fed," Marcus often joked, his Australian mother's accent slipping through in moments of fatigue or emotion. Michael inherited not only his father's striking features, but also his strength of character. An exemplary 7th grader, president of the student council, and passionate about chess, the boy already demonstrated the same strategic intelligence that made his father stand out in the FBI. His dark skin and curly hair were a source of pride, though they often attracted prejudiced looks in their predominantly white suburban Boston neighborhood. The 3 officers now following him, Lieutenant Rick Johnson, Sergeant William Williams, and Officer Tom Thompson, were pieces of a much larger puzzle. Johnson, the leader of the group, had 15 years on the force and a file full of suspicious incidents that always ended up mysteriously archived. "No worries, mates," Johnson would say, his Aussie drawl a stark contrast to his Boston beat. "It'll all be sorted, fair dinkum." Williams, his right-hand man, was known for his brutality during arrests, especially with young black men. "Just doing my duty in it," he'd justify, his London Cockney oddly menacing in the New England setting. Thompson, the youngest of the three, had recently been drawn into the corruption scheme, seduced by the promise of easy money. "Sorry about this, eh?" he'd mutter after particularly rough arrests, his Canadian politeness a jarring juxtaposition to his actions. The town, seemingly quiet with its 100,000 inhabitants, hid a complex network of corruption that extended from the local police to the highest echelons of power. The municipal lake, where everything was about to unfold, was more than just a simple postcard. It was a strategic point for illicit operations that took place in the dead of night. The investigation conducted by Agent Smith had been ongoing for 2 years. Covertly, he had mapped the entire organization, discovering that some local police officers were providing security for a smuggling scheme that used the lake as a distribution route. What he didn't know was that his investigation had been discovered and that his enemies were planning to strike at him through what he loved most. Mrs. Zoe, an elderly hot dog vendor near the lake for 30 years, was the silent witness to many dark stories. That afternoon, she watched the scene unfold with concern. She had known Michael since he was little and had witnessed several questionable police approaches in the area. Her hot dog cart, strategically positioned, had a hidden camera installed by Agent Smith himself months ago. "Cor blimey," Zoe muttered, her Cockney accent a remnant of her East London youth. "This don't look good, not one bit." The stage was set like a chess game, where each piece occupied its strategic position. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky blood red, while the waters of the lake reflected the last lights of the day. The wind carried the smell of Zoe's hot dogs, mixed with the characteristic odor of the lake's still waters, creating an atmosphere that oscillated between the familiar and the threatening. Michael, feeling the weight of the moment, took a deep breath. He remembered his father's words. "In this country, son, we're often judged by the color of our skin before the content of our character. But never let that define you. Your actions, your integrity, that's what truly matters." With one last glance over his shoulder, Michael steeled himself for what was to come, unaware that this encounter would be the catalyst for change that would ripple across the entire nation. "Oi, kid, stop right there!" Lieutenant Johnson's voice cut through the air like a knife. Michael felt his body freeze, but maintained the posture his father had always taught him. He stopped, turned calmly, and responded with a firm voice. "Good afternoon, officers." The polite response seemed to irritate the three men even more. Sergeant Williams circled Michael like a predator. "Quite the proper little gent, aren't we? Let's see some ID, shall we?" Michael calmly opened his backpack, his fingers trembling slightly as he searched for his school ID. His phone continued to vibrate insistently in his pocket. "That bag looks a tad heavy for just school stuff, eh?" Officer Thompson chimed in, yanking the backpack from Michael's hands. Books and notebooks were thrown to the ground, scattering near the lake's edge. The high-end school uniform and quality materials seemed to arouse even more suspicion from the officers. "How does a kid like you afford such fancy gear?" Johnson questioned, kicking an advanced math book. "Must be nicked, I reckon." Michael felt anger rising in his chest, but his father's voice echoed in his mind. "Never let them take you off your center, son. Your dignity is your greatest weapon." "My father bought all the materials," Michael replied, maintaining his composure. "He's a Fed." Before he could finish his sentence, he was interrupted by a shove from Sergeant Williams. "Your father? Pull the other one, mate. Must be a drug dealer to have that kind of dosh." The sun was now even lower, creating elongated shadows that danced on the lake's waters. Michael's phone vibrated one last time in his pocket, his father's unread message. "Son, be careful. I've discovered corrupt cops are after me. Don't take the lake path home today." Johnson grabbed the phone from Michael's pocket, a recent model. Well, what have we here? More evidence that something's not quite cricket." He unlocked the screen forcefully, using Michael's finger against his will. His father's message flashed on the screen, but before it could be read, Williams had already snatched the device and hurled it into the lake. "Oops, butterfingers," the sergeant laughed as the phone sank into the dark waters. Michael felt tears of anger forming, but he didn't let them fall. The three officers now completely surrounded him, blocking any escape route. "Can you swim, lad?" Johnson asked with a cruel smile. "Because your mobile could use some company." Michael's heart raced as he understood the threat. At that moment, just a few miles away, his father was signing the final documents that would incriminate these very three men in a corruption and trafficking scheme. The tension reached its peak when Johnson nodded and the other two officers grabbed Michael by the arms. The boy didn't scream, didn't beg. He maintained his dignity until the last second, even when he felt his feet leave the ground. "Let's see if you can swim as well as you lie," Johnson said, as his accomplices swung Michael over the dark waters of the lake. Mrs. Zoe shouted from afar. Other people began to take out their phones, but it was too late. The sound of Michael's body hitting the cold water echoed across the lake, mixing with the officers' laughter. What they didn't know was that this moment was being recorded by several cameras, and that the father of the boy they had just assaulted was precisely the man who was about to destroy their lives. As Michael struggled to keep his head above water, he could hear the commotion on the shore. People were shouting, some in horror, others in anger. Through the splashing, he made out Mrs. Zoe's distinct Cockney accent. "Oi, you bloody bastards, that's Agent Smith's boy." The officers' laughter quickly died down as the gravity of their mistake began to dawn on them. Johnson's face paled as he muttered, "Bloody hell, Smith's kid." In that moment, sirens could be heard in the distance, growing louder by the second. The corrupt officers looked at each other, panic setting in as they realized the magnitude of what they had just done. Michael, treading water, locked eyes with Johnson. Despite the cold and fear, a small, defiant smile played on his lips. He knew in that moment that everything was about to change. As Michael fought against the cold waters of the lake, other gears were silently turning. At the FBI field office, Marcus's secretary, Sarah Turner, had just received an anonymous call about the incident involving her boss's son. A former Royal Canadian Mounted Police officer, Sarah immediately recognized the names of the three officers involved. "Bloody hell," Sarah muttered, her Canadian accent thickening with stress. "This is going to be a right mess, eh?" Meanwhile, Captain Robert Allen, the immediate superior of the three corrupt officers, was monitoring the situation through coded messages on his cell phone. He was the link between the local police and a larger criminal organization that used the lake as a smuggling route. The presence of the FBI agent's son in that area was no mere coincidence. It was a message. Mrs. Zoe wasn't just a hot dog vendor, widow of a police officer killed under mysterious circumstances 15 years ago. She had been secretly collaborating with Marcus for months, documenting suspicious activities around the lake. Her late husband had discovered the same corruption scheme, paying for his honesty with his life. "Cor blimey," Zoe whispered to herself as she watched Michael struggle in the water. "History's bloody well repeating itself, innit?" At the town hospital, the ER doctor on duty, Dr. Rachel Johnson, Lieutenant Johnson's sister, was battling her conscience. For weeks, her brother had been exhibiting increasingly erratic behavior, making comments about teaching a nosy fed a lesson. She had evidence that could incriminate her own brother, but fear and family loyalty kept her silent. Officer Thompson, the youngest of the three policemen, felt the weight of his choices. His pregnant wife didn't know he had gotten involved with the corruption scheme to pay off gambling debts. With each move against Michael, he saw his own unborn child. "Crikey," Thompson muttered, his Australian accent slipping out in his distress. "What have I gotten myself into?" In the town centre, a secret meeting was taking place between local businessmen and politicians. The scheme that Marcus was investigating went far beyond smuggling. It involved money laundering through overpriced public works, including the recent revitalization of the municipal lake. The cold water that now enveloped Michael carried not only the secrets of smuggling, but also evidence that his father had been collecting for months. At the bottom of the lake, along with his cell phone, lay other proof of crimes that the town preferred to keep submerged. Sarah, realizing the gravity of the situation, activated an emergency protocol established by Marcus. A tactical FBI team, which was on standby for the main operation, received new coordinates. The original plan would need to be brought forward. Amidst this whirlwind of events, a dark van parked discreetly near the lake. Its driver, an undercover federal agent, observed the scene through high-precision cameras, transmitting everything in real time to the operations center. "Struth!" the agent whispered into his comm, his Australian accent barely audible. "This is going pear-shaped real quick." Michael's fate was now intertwined with a web of corruption, divided loyalties, and deadly secrets. Each person witnessing the scene carried their own story, their own motivations, transforming an apparent case of police abuse into a breaking point that threatened to expose years of covered-up crimes. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the lake, the stage was set for a confrontation that would shake the foundations of the town and beyond. The ripples from Michael's struggle in the water were about to become a tidal wave of change, washing away years of corruption and injustice. The moment that changed everything happened at 6:07 p.m. Michael emerged from the frigid waters of the lake, not as a frightened victim, but as someone who had just awakened a storm. Years of swimming training, his father's insistence, made the difference between life and death, but it wasn't just him that emerged. "FBI, freeze!" The thunderous voice of Special Agent Marcus Smith exploded in the air, causing the three corrupt officers to freeze in their tracks. Within seconds, unmarked vehicles surrounded the area and heavily armed agents appeared from all sides. The dark van that had been observing everything opened its doors, revealing a complete mobile command center. Lieutenant Johnson's face transformed into a mask of horror as he recognized Marcus Smith, the FBI agent whose photo was on his phone, marked as the main target of the criminal organization. "Bloody hell! It can't be," he stammered, realizing the fatal mistake he had just made, but the real twist was yet to come. Michael, as he was being rescued from the waters by two federal agents, smiled. From his soaked uniform, he pulled out a waterproof device, an ultra-sensitive recorder that had captured every word of the corrupt officers. His daily walk by the lake was no coincidence. It was part of his father's operation. "You were brilliant, son," Marcus said, wrapping Michael in a towel before turning to the officers with a look that could freeze hell itself. "You not only assaulted a minor, but also interfered with an ongoing federal operation. Every second is recorded." At this moment, Mrs. Zoe approached, handing the federal agents an external hard drive. "I've got 6 months of recordings, Agent Smith, including the nighttime activity at the lake." Her revelation as an undercover agent caused astonishment among the criminals. The hot dog cart, strategically positioned for years in that location, was actually a sophisticated surveillance post. "Blimey," Zoe said, her Cockney accent thick with emotion. "Bet you didn't see that coming, did you?" Captain Robert Allen, who had been observing everything from afar, tried to discreetly flee, but was surprised by a tactical team that was already waiting for him. On his cell phone, all the necessary evidence to connect the local police to the international smuggling scheme. Officer Thompson, seeing his life crumble, made a decision that would change his fate. "I want to cooperate," he said, to the horror of his accomplices. "I've got evidence on all the operations, including about Mrs. Zoe's husband's death 15 years ago." The crowd that had formed around watched in astonishment as the operation unfolded. Cell phones recorded everything, transforming an act of police brutality into a spectacle of justice being served in real time. The true nature of Marcus's investigation finally came to light. His son wasn't an accidental victim, but a key piece in a meticulously crafted plan. "You thought you were intimidating a defenseless boy," Marcus announced as the officers were being handcuffed. "But in reality, you fell into the only trap that could expose the entire scheme at once. My son is braver than you'll ever be." Dr. Rachel Johnson, who had rushed to the scene after hearing about the commotion, stood in shock as she watched her brother being led away in handcuffs. "Rick," she called out, her voice breaking, "what have you done?" The waters of the lake, now calm after the tumult, reflected the lights of the police vehicles, creating a show of red and blue in the darkening sky. Michael, still wet but proud, observed the scene beside his father, knowing that his sacrifice had been worth it. The town would never be the same after that afternoon. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared, Marcus put his arm around his son's shoulders. "You okay, mate?" he asked, his Australian accent slipping out in the emotional moment. Michael nodded, a mix of exhaustion and triumph on his face. "Yeah, Dad, we did it, didn't we?" Marcus smiled, pride shining in his eyes. "We sure did, son. We sure did." The lake, once a symbol of the town's hidden corruption, now stood as a testament to the courage of a young boy and the relentless pursuit of justice. As night fell, the ripples on the water's surface seemed to whisper of change, of a new dawn approaching for the town and perhaps for the nation. The hours following the operation at the lake transformed the quiet town into a media frenzy. Videos of the violent approach and subsequent federal operation went viral on social media, generating millions of views within hours. The justice of the lake and Outer Agent Smith became the most trending topics nationwide. At the FBI field office, Officer Thompson was spilling crucial details of the scheme. His confession implicated not just corrupt police officers, but also local businessmen and high-ranking politicians. The death of Mrs. Zoe's husband, filed away as a robbery gone wrong 15 years ago, was reopened as a case of premeditated execution. "Crikey," Thompson muttered, his Australian accent thickening with stress. "It goes deeper than I ever imagined, mate." Lieutenant Johnson and Sergeant Williams, now in separate cells, faced the harsh reality of their choices. Johnson, in particular, received a visit from his sister, Dr. Rachel. "I tried to warn you, Rick," she said, her British accent contrasting sharply with her brother's adopted Aussie drawl. She handed the investigators a folder with documents proving her brother's involvement in other crimes. "You chose the wrong side of history." Captain Robert Allen, during interrogation, broke under pressure. He revealed the existence of a much larger scheme involving authorities from 3 states. His confession triggered a series of simultaneous operations in several cities, leading to more arrests and seizures. "Blimey," Allen whispered, his face ashen. "They'll have my guts for garters for this." Michael, after being examined at the hospital and released, became a national symbol of resistance and courage. Journalists desperately tried to secure an interview with the boy who helped dismantle a criminal organization. His photo, emerging dignifiedly from the waters of the lake, graced the front pages of major newspapers across the country. At school, Michael's classmates received him as a hero the next day. The principal organized a special assembly, turning the story into a lesson about courage, justice, and the importance of combating structural racism. The boy, maintaining the same dignity as always, used the opportunity to speak about the importance of education and integrity. "It's not about being a hero," Michael addressed his peers, his voice steady. "It's about standing up for what's right, even when it's scary." Mrs. Zoe, now revealed as an FBI collaborator, needed special protection. Her crucial role in the operation transformed her into a target for threats, but also into an example of persistence in the pursuit of justice. Her hot dog cart was retired and replaced by a kiosk, a gift from Agent Smith, strategically positioned to continue her observations. "Core blimey," Zoe chuckled, serving her first customer at the new kiosk. "Who'd have thought selling hot dogs could bring down the baddies?" The town hall, amid the scandal, found itself forced to initiate an internal investigation into the lake revitalization works. Documents began to surface, revealing million-dollar overcharges and diversions. The mayor, though denying involvement, now faced an impeachment process. In the local police department, an unprecedented cleanup was initiated. New approach protocols were implemented, with special emphasis on combating institutional racism. Body cameras became mandatory, and a direct channel with internal affairs was established. "It's a new day for law enforcement in this town," the new police chief announced, his Canadian accent emphasizing each word. "We're gonna do things right, eh?" As the dust began to settle, the town found itself at a crossroads. The exposure of such deep-rooted corruption had shaken the community to its core, but it also presented an opportunity for real change. Agent Marcus Smith, standing at the edge of the lake where it all began, looked out over the water. "You know, son," he said to Michael, who stood beside him, "sometimes it takes a storm to clear the air." Michael nodded, his young face serious beyond his years. "Yeah, Dad, but the real work is just beginning, isn't it?" Marcus smiled, ruffling his son's hair. "Too right, mate. Too right." As they turned to leave, the setting sun cast long shadows across the lake, a reminder of the darkness they had faced and the brighter future they were working towards. In the weeks following the lake incident, Michael faced an emotional roller coaster. Despite being celebrated as a hero, he internally struggled with the trauma of his experience. Nightmares about drowning tormented him, and anxiety at the sight of police uniforms was palpable. Recognizing the need for support, Marcus enrolled his son in therapy sessions with Dr. Camilla Roche, a specialist in childhood trauma. "G'day, Michael," Dr. Roche greeted him in her warm Australian accent. "Let's have a yarn about what's going on in that noggin of yours, shall we?" During these sessions, Michael began to process not just the recent event, but years of racial microaggressions he had normalized. "You didn't have to be strong all the time," Dr. Roche told him gently. "It's okay to feel fear, anger, sadness. That doesn't diminish your courage." Gradually, Michael learned to express his emotions in a healthy way, using writing and art as outlets. Meanwhile, Marcus faced his own demons. The operation's success brought national recognition, but also the weight of guilt for putting his son in danger. One particularly difficult night, father and son had a frank conversation. "I'm sorry, Michael," Marcus said, tears in his eyes, his Australian accent thickening with emotion. "I should have protected you, not used you as bait." Michael, showing maturity beyond his years, replied, "Dad, we both knew the risks. We did this for Mum, for Mrs. Zoe, for everyone who suffers injustice every day." This conversation marked a turning point in their relationship. Marcus began to open up more emotionally, sharing stories about Michael's mother and his own experiences with racism throughout his career. These nightly talks became a healing ritual for both. At school, Michael took on a more active role in the student council, organizing debates on social justice and racial equality. Inspired by his experience, he initiated a mentoring project, connecting young black students with successful professionals in various fields. "If I could face corrupt cops," he told his peers, "you can be anything you want to be." Mrs. Zoe, now a respected figure in the community, transformed her kiosk into a meeting point for discussions on citizenship and human rights. On Sundays, she organized talk circles where she shared her story and encouraged others to speak about their experiences with injustice and prejudice. "Listen up, you lot," she'd say in her Cockney accent. "We've got stories to tell and changes to make." Officer Thompson, serving his sentence in a federal prison, began a redemption process. He started collaborating with rehabilitation programs for police officers, sharing his story as a warning about the dangers of corruption. His wife, initially devastated by the revelation, found strength to support his journey of transformation, especially after the birth of their child. Marcus, inspired by Michael's resilience, proposed significant changes to FBI training protocols. He developed a program focused on racial awareness and police ethics, which was soon adopted as a national model. "It's not enough to not be racist," he argued in lectures, his accent a mix of Australian and American after years in the States. "We need to be actively anti-racist." The town, still recovering from the scandal, saw the birth of various community-based movements. Citizen watchdog groups were formed to monitor police action, while social projects aimed at youth from the periphery gained strength, many of them with Michael as an ambassador. 6 months after the incident, Michael returned to the lake for the first time. Accompanied by his father, Mrs. Zoe, and a group of friends, he organized a symbolic ceremony. They released flowers into the water in memory of all victims of police violence and racial injustice. "This lake is no longer a place of fear," Michael declared. "It's a reminder that the truth always rises to the surface." As the flowers drifted on the water, a diverse group of townspeople gathered on the shore. The once divisive lake had become a symbol of unity and change. "Cor blimey," Mrs. Zoe said, wiping a tear. "Who'd have thought we'd see the day?" Marcus put his arm around his son's shoulders. "You've started something big here, mate," he said proudly. Michael nodded, his young face serious but hopeful. "Yeah, Dad, but it's just the beginning, isn't it?" As they turned to leave, Michael caught sight of his reflection in the lake. The boy who stared back was different from the one who had been thrown in months ago. Stronger, wiser, but still determined to fight for what's right. "Come on," he said to the group. "We've got work to do." 1 year after the lake incident, the town was preparing for an unprecedented event, the trial of the officers involved in Michael's case. Tension was palpable in the streets, with protesters from both sides gathering in front of the courthouse. Signs demanding justice contrasted with others defending the police, evidencing the division still present in society. Michael, now 13 and visibly more mature, would be the key witness. In the weeks leading up to the trial, he worked tirelessly with the prosecution, reliving every detail of that fateful day. Therapy sessions with Dr. Roche intensified, helping him deal with the anxiety of the impending testimony. "Remember, mate," Dr. Roche advised, her Aussie accent soothing, "your truth is your strength. Just tell it like it happened." Marcus, meanwhile, was fighting a battle behind the scenes. Veiled threats were coming from all directions, indicating that the corruption network was even more extensive than they had imagined. Sarah Turner, his loyal secretary, discovered attempts to hack into the FBI systems, aiming to compromise the case evidence. "Crikey," Sarah muttered, her Canadian accent thickening with stress. "These buggers don't give up, do they?" The agent decided to take drastic measures. With the help of an elite FBI team, he orchestrated a maximum security plan for the day of the trial. Every street around the courthouse was mapped, every court employee investigated. The operation was so secret that not even Michael knew all the details. Mrs. Zoe, now a respected figure in the community, mobilized an army of volunteers to ensure that the trial was closely monitored by civil society. Her kiosk transformed into an information center, distributing pamphlets about the importance of the case for police reform. "Listen up, you lot," she announced to her volunteers, her Cockney accent commanding attention. "We're going to make sure justice is served fair and square." On the eve of the big day, an unexpected twist occurred. Officer Thompson, who had become a key witness for the prosecution, was found unconscious in his cell. Rumors of poisoning spread quickly, threatening to destabilize the entire process. Dr. Rachel Johnson, Lieutenant Johnson's sister and now an ally of the prosecution, was called in urgently to care for Thompson and ensure his presence in court. "Bloody hell!" Dr. Johnson exclaimed, her British accent sharp with concern. "We can't let them silence him now." Meanwhile, at the Smith household, Michael and Marcus had a crucial conversation. "Son, tomorrow you'll face the toughest moment of your life," Marcus said, pride and concern mixing in his voice. "Remember, your voice isn't just your own. You speak for all those who never had the chance to be heard." Michael nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility. "Dad, what if they're acquitted? What if all this was for nothing?" The question hung in the air for a moment. Marcus put his hands on his son's shoulders and replied, "None of this will be in vain. Every word of yours is a seed of change. No matter the outcome, you've already changed the course of history." On the morning of the trial, the town woke up in tense silence. The usually busy streets were deserted, with most inhabitants glued to their TVs, awaiting news. At the courthouse, journalists from across the country jostled for a better position. When the armored car bringing Michael and Marcus arrived, a crowd exploded in applause and shouts of support. Across the street, A smaller but noisy group shouted in defense of the accused officers. The thin line between justice and chaos never seemed so fragile. As they climbed the courthouse steps, Michael took a deep breath, remembering Mrs. Zoe's words. "You're not alone in there, love. You carry the hopes of generations." With one last look at his father, Michael opened the doors, ready to face his destiny and possibly change the course of history. The air was thick with anticipation, the weight of the moment palpable to all present. "You've got this, son," Marcus whispered, his accent a mix of his Australian roots and American present. "Show them what real courage looks like." The courtroom was packed, the air heavy with expectation and tension. Michael, dressed in a suit that made him look older than his 13 years, took the witness stand. His eyes scanned the room, finding familiar faces. His father, Mrs. Zoe, Dr. Roche. On the other side, the three accused officers stared at him, their gazes a mixture of anger and fear. "Michael Smith," the prosecutor began, her crisp British accent cutting through the silence. "Can you tell us, in your own words, what happened that afternoon at the lake?" With a deep breath, Michael began his account. His voice, initially trembling, gained strength as he described the events. He didn't just narrate the facts. He painted a vivid picture of the systematic discrimination he faced daily. "It wasn't just about that day," Michael declared, his voice echoing through the room. "It was about every suspicious look, every unjustified stop, every time I felt less because of the color of my skin." The defense tried to discredit his testimony, suggesting he was being manipulated by his father. "Don't you think it's a bit too convenient that the FBI agent's son just happened to be the victim of this alleged abuse?" the defense attorney asked, his southern drawl dripping with sarcasm. Michael didn't flinch. "What would be convenient, sir, is if I could walk down the street without fear, if officers saw me as a citizen, not a threat." His response caused a murmur in the gallery. The turning point came when the prosecution presented the recordings. Michael's calm, dignified voice contrasted sharply with the officers' insults and threats. The jurors' expressions visibly changed as the evidence mounted. Then came the surprise. Officer Thompson, still recovering from the poisoning attempt, was called to testify. He entered stumbling, supported by Dr. Rachel Johnson. His testimony was devastating, detailing years of corruption and abuse of power. "I'm not here to redeem myself," Thompson said, his voice weak but determined, his Australian accent more pronounced under stress. "I'm here because that boy," he pointed at Michael, "showed more courage than I've seen in 15 years on the force." The defense, desperate, tried one last gambit. They called Captain Robert Allen, hoping he would deny involvement and protect his subordinates. But Allen, confronted with irrefutable evidence and the prospect of a harsher sentence, broke. "It was all planned," Allen confessed, to the shock of the court. "We knew who the boy was. The idea was to intimidate him, send a message to Agent Smith." His confession was the final nail in the coffin. The judge, visibly shaken, called a recess for deliberation. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. Outside, the crowd waited anxiously, TVs broadcasting every development live. When the verdict was announced, the silence was deafening. "Guilty on all charges," declared the judge, her Midwestern accent firm and clear. The sentence was severe, 20 years for Johnson and Williams, 15 for Thompson, with reduction for cooperation, and 25 for Allen. The explosion of emotions was immediate. Shouts of joy mixed with sobs of relief. Michael, finally letting his composure mask fall, hugged his father, sobbing. "We did it, Dad. We really did it." Marcus, tears in his eyes, held his son's face between his hands. "You did it, son. You changed everything." Mrs. Zoe, openly crying, hugged them both. "My husband can finally rest in peace," she whispered, her Cockney accent thick with emotion. Outside the courthouse, the news spread like wildfire. The crowd erupted in celebrations. Posters with Michael's face were raised, now a symbol of hope and change. As they were led out of the courtroom, the convicted officers finally faced the reality of their actions. Johnson, the last to leave, looked at Michael one last time. There was no more arrogance in his eyes, only a mixture of shame and belated regret. Michael left the courthouse on his father's shoulders, waving to the crowd. At that moment, he wasn't just a 13-year-old boy. He was the catalyst for a long-needed change, the face of a new era of justice and equality. As the sun set on this historic day, casting long shadows across the courthouse steps, Michael turned to his father. "What now, Dad?" he asked, his young voice filled with a mix of exhaustion and hope. Marcus smiled, his accent a blend of his Australian roots and American present. "Now, son, we keep moving forward. The fight for justice never ends, but today we've won a crucial battle." In the months following the historic trial, the town and the nation underwent a profound transformation. Michael's case became a turning point in the fight against institutional racism and police corruption. The FBI, under Special Agent Marcus Smith's leadership, implemented a revolutionary training program in diversity and human rights. The Michael Project, as it became known, turned into a national model, adopted by police departments across the United States. Incidents of police violence against minorities began to drop significantly. "It's not just about changing policies," Marcus would say in his presentations, his Aussie-American accent adding emphasis. "It's about changing hearts and minds." Michael, now 14, transformed into a nationally respected activist. His eloquence and maturity led him to speak at schools, universities, and even before Congress. "It's not enough to not be racist," he repeated, echoing his father's words. "We need to be actively anti-racist." Mrs. Zoe expanded her community project, transforming her kiosk into an NGO dedicated to offering legal and psychological support to victims of police violence. The name, Justice Dogs, a humorous tribute to her crucial role in the case. "Who'd have thought," she'd chuckle in her Cockney accent, "that a hot dog stand would serve up justice?" Officer Thompson, serving his sentence, dedicated himself to a police rehabilitation program. His talks on the dangers of corruption and the importance of integrity became a mandatory part of training for new recruits. Dr. Rachel Johnson, Lieutenant Johnson's sister, took on a leadership role in reforming the prison healthcare system, ensuring dignified treatment even for those she considered to have betrayed their oath. The lake, once the scene of a heinous crime, was revitalized and transformed into a memorial. A bronze statue representing Michael emerging from the waters became a symbol of resistance and hope. "It's not about me," Michael insisted at the statue's unveiling. "It's about what we can all do when we stand up for what's right." Marcus Smith, nationally recognized for his work, received invitations for political positions, but chose to remain on the front lines of crime fighting. "My place is on the streets, ensuring that my son's sacrifice wasn't in vain," he declared. The media closely followed Michael's evolution. Documentaries, books, and even a TV series were produced telling his story. But for the young man, the most important thing was the real impact on people's lives. On a quiet afternoon, exactly 2 years after the incident, Michael and his father walked by the lake. The place, once a source of trauma, now emanated peace. "You know, Dad," said Michael, "sometimes I wonder if all this was worth it." Marcus looked at his son, now almost his height, with undisguised pride. "Look around you, son. See how things have changed. You didn't just survive, you transformed a tragedy into triumph. You gave voice to the voiceless." Michael smiled, watching families of all colors peacefully enjoying the park. "I guess you're right," he replied, "but our work is far from over." "Too right, mate," Marcus agreed, his accent thickening with emotion. "But now we know change is possible, and that, son, is the greatest legacy we could leave." 5 years later, Michael, now 19, was entering law school at Harvard. His goal, to become a civil rights attorney, fighting for those who couldn't defend themselves. In a moving ceremony, he was honored by the federal government with the Martin Luther King Jr. Freedom Medal for his tireless work against racism. Receiving the award, Michael dedicated it to all who fought before him. "This isn't the end of the journey," he declared, his voice carrying the weight of his experiences. "It's a new beginning. Together, we'll build a future where no child will have to go through what I did to be heard and respected." Hey folks, if you've watched this far, drop a comment saying, "I watched till the end." Michael's story shows us that change is possible, but it depends on each one of us. How about reflecting on how we can combat racism and injustice in our daily lives? Share your ideas in the comments. And don't forget to click on the video popping up on the screen now. We've got more inspiring stories waiting for you. Together, we can make a difference. Whether you're in Sydney, London, Toronto, or New York, your voice matters. Until next time, mates.